after implementing the circadian principles, which I'd learned from the podcast and had reinforced by doing the CRD challenge, it took 6 weeks for about 80% of my psoriasis symptoms to completely disappear. It was shockingly rapid. And yes, I know that it is a photosensitive condition. Phototherapy, UVB therapy is prescribed in psoriasis, even in traditional Western medicine applications. So I feel like there is some understanding of light's role in the development of psoriasis, but I never expected things to change as quickly as they did.
Can you imagine waking up one day covered in head to toe psoriasis? What a nightmare. My guests today are Jay Kapoor and Daniel White. Jay shares his story of having full body psoriasis for multiple years and what finally healed it. You'll never guess what it is. Okay, you will totally guess what it is. That's why he's on here. And he's here along with his business partner, Daniel White. The two of them have created a company that makes a circadian friendly light bulb. And they share the science behind healing with light and why it had such a huge impact for Jay's condition. Super inspiring. Please, if you are suffering, please keep looking for the answer. Maybe it's light, maybe it's something else. The light is a fundamental piece, of course, but please don't give up. And today's episode is also sponsored by a special organization called the Podcastathon. I have got together with hundreds of other podcasts, and we are all committed to highlighting a nonprofit organization on our episode this week. So I, of course, have chosen the Institute of Applied Quantum Biology, which is bridging the gap between the research and the practical and clinical application of the science behind quantum biology. If you are interested in learning more of that in any capacity as a practitioner or an entrepreneur, or a deep health seeker, please do visit iaqb.foundation. All the links are in the show notes, or go to qbcpod.com and click Institute. There's lots of fun stuff happening there, including a very exciting announcement. I can't give the full details yet. We're not quite ready, but it's going to be really cool. And I'd love for you all to be involved. And I want to take a minute to thank you all for the work that you do. I want to thank you so much for sharing this podcast, for listening to it, for being on the front lines of the chronic illness epidemic, whether as a practitioner or somebody who's working through it themselves or with their family. Bless you, bon courage, and thank you all so much for the work that you do. And as always, do visit our friends at bondcharge.com. Put QBC in the discount box at checkout. They do so much to make this podcast possible, and I really appreciate their support. Also, my Circadian app. You're going to want to download that if you're serious about managing your circadian rhythms. My Circadian app makes that much, much easier to do than just trying to figure it out on your own. Put QBC Pod in the little box at checkout when you download that app. And of course, visit qbcpod.com. A lot of QBCs thrown around here. qbcpod.com. And you could just ignore everything I said because there's links to everything on that website. This is a really, really fun conversation, starting with the deeply personal and ending up on how we can shift the infrastructure of the world to a more biologically supportive environment. I think we can do it. I think we can. What do you think? I don't know. Let me know. Have fun. So delighted to have you both here together in your orange glasses.
Thank you so much, Meredith. It's a pleasure to be here again.
Yeah, we've got a lot of time zones going on here. So I've got the morning light in my face. It's like the middle of the night for Jay. It's like early evening for Daniel. We've got all the shades of blue blockers.
Absolutely.
All good. All right. So let's start off with your stories. You both have incredible stories of recovery from stumbling onto the principles of quantum biology and realizing how our modern life has set us up to get destroyed unless we know what we're doing. Should we jump in? Daniel, do you want to start? And then Jay, I'm excited to hear your story as well.
Destroyed for me is putting it lightly. And I think for you as well, Jay, to be honest. Yeah, let me revisit, and we'll keep it short because I know that there was a previous episode where I was on the podcast and I spoke in kind of longer terms about my story, but mine really began for me when I was around 13 or 14 years old. I was in secondary education in the UK, and became one of the first children I knew of my generation who was super addicted to computers, technology, video gaming. And it went from, an evening habit to late night every single day, 2 a.m., 3 a.m., staring into bright blue lit LED screens. As a result, things like my immune system, my weight, my mood, all of those things shattered. So I was very anxious, very depressed, very, very overweight, was suffering from autoimmune conditions, eczema, psoriasis, you name it, things were really falling apart for me. And I kind of went on this crusade initially, as many do, around nutrition and exercise, eating less and moving more. And that certainly had impacts on my health. But it took me almost, a full decade from that point of studying degrees in psychology, masters in nutrition, even looking into functional medicine and really not finding the answers that I was looking for. And it wasn't until I actually connected with one of your faculty and a great long friend of mine, someone whose podcast we've actually been on recently, a guy called Nathan Walls. And Nathan was sharing some research looking at the impacts of, circadian biology and morning light and evening light and things such as that. And it was kind of like my coming home moment, I guess. I bought my first pair of blue blockers probably about 8 or 9 years ago now, and noticed the immediate impact that it had on my well-being. You fast forward a few years and I became so passionate about the topic that I decided to register a charity. And you, Meredith, as well as, the Quantum Biology Collective, were a massive motivator, and they're an inspiration to conduct a research project in the Channel Islands where I basically equipped hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of children with blue light blocking glasses, education. We studied, we researched, we published a non-academic, not peer-reviewed paper looking at, some of the phenomenal benefits of these, circadian and kind of quantum biology interventions. And then through that, I discovered some colleagues that I used to work with, the wonderful Avi and Lauren Jacobson and Jeff Gibson, who I know have all been, I think, on the podcast perhaps before. And we founded the CRD Challenge. And that's something that now sits under the wheelhouse of the Quantum Biology Collective very happily. And then, moving forward from there, these mass, I guess you could say, philanthropic attempts at providing education and raising awareness and raising consciousness around these topics. One day in a little cafe in London, I met this wonderful man called Jay Kapoor, and that's probably the shortest that I've ever told my story. And I'll pass that on now on over to Jay.
Okay. So Jay, what are you doing when you meet Daniel? What's your situation?
Oh gosh, it was actually quite a humorous meeting. But look, my background's a bit different to Dan's, though. As the universe should have it, we ended up in the same place at the same time. So I'm of Indian descent. My parents are Indian. I grew up between London and Nigeria, and really, my whole life, for as long as I can remember, was really defined by, I think, really garnering a big sense of self-worth from material achievement. In school, it was academics, in university academics, then it was high-flying jobs in investment banking and fintech, and most recently as a financial exec at UK startup Wave. It's actually not a startup anymore. It's quite a large company now. But we were using building end-to-end AI networks for self-driving. Something that's been, popularized a lot more since the advent of ChatGPT, but we were using that to solve the self-driving problem back in 2017. And so, the career got higher and higher, and it hit higher heights than I ever thought possible at that stage. But like with many other people, eventually the health gave out, and I developed very aggressive autoimmune psoriasis very, very suddenly. Probably stress induced, and on the top of a number of different lifestyle habits that were out of alignment. So I later learned that from having near perfect skin, within the space of just a few months, I had psoriasis on almost every square inch of my body. I don't know, Dan, if
Oh
we've
my
sent.
goodness.
Yeah,
That's crazy.
Oh, the
it
photos
was
are bad. I've never seen psoriasis this bad.
We can
Wow.
send
And it
them
happened that fast.
super fast. Yeah, round about sort of midway 2022, and I didn't know what it was, but it just got worse. And that's the thing that I eventually learned with psoriasis, right? So people struggle with psoriasis, for their whole lives. It's a very common condition, but what I learned is that it tends to flare up and flare down for people, or it sort of tends to oscillate around this baseline. But mine just didn't behave like that. It just went exponentially worse and worse and worse.
Just went from 0 to 100 and stayed there.
Yeah. And it was just,
Oh.
was truly horrific. And, I went on a very typical journey that many of us in this space have gone on, which is you go to your doctor, right? Full of hope. And then the doctor sort of
Yeah.
says you autoimmune psoriasis. They sort of shrug their shoulders at you. And so after that, I then went down the alternative route. And, this is probably spanning a 3 or 4 year period of trying, Ayurveda, Chinese medicine, even, your osteopathy and craniosacral and different forms of breath work and dietary restrictions, gave up gluten, dairy, and eggs, went on the autoimmune protocol diet as a predominant vegetarian at the time, which was basically like just eating green vegetables,
Oh,
which
that's
in and of
rough.
itself is not a great, dietary setup. But the key point being nothing really worked and nothing really landed until I met young Dan on that fateful day in London. And I see Dan, where we're in the cafe in this sort of conscious community called Ansol. And Dan starts talking to me, and I'm still in a lot of pain at this point, so I wasn't really in the mood to be talking to people. And Dan starts waxing off on me, and he says he works in quantum biology, which I think is a made up at this point, right?
You're like,
Because
get away from me, you
I
whacked
get
out.
away from me. I'm sufficiently, my curiosity is sufficiently piqued so that I sort of, he runs off and I sort of follow him, and I'm sort of like, there's something interesting about this guy. Then, of course, I see him going outside and taking off his glasses and looking at the sky. And I'm thinking, this guy is, I don't know what he's on, because he's just acting super strange. But then, I chase him up. He tells me about the circadian rhythm and circadian biology, and he sends me down the biggest rabbit hole where I meet the likes of Dr. Jack Cruz and Dr. Alexis Cowan on the podcast streams. And it feels like a lifetime of science, nerdiness, and hobbyism sort of really comes to this singular like aha moment when I kind of hear all the stories and the science from these amazing researchers in the field, and it just made sense. And so this was December in London, where there isn't a lot of light, and so my cousin was getting married in Mexico, in Cancun, and so I stayed out there. I cancelled my return ticket, so I voluntarily took myself somewhere where I could do this properly. And after implementing the circadian principles, which I'd learned from the podcast and had reinforced by doing the CRD challenge, it took six weeks for about 80% of my psoriasis symptoms to completely disappear. It was shocking.
Wow.
It was shockingly rapid. And yes, I know that psoriasis,
Crazy.
it was crazy, right? And psoriasis, look, it is a photosensitive condition. Phototherapy, UVB therapy is prescribed with, in psoriasis, even in traditional, Western medicine applications. So I feel like there is some understanding of light's role in the development of psoriasis, but I never expected things to change as quickly as they did. 6 weeks, about 80% improvement in symptoms, another 3 months for probably the 20%, and then another 3 or 4 months for the psychological pincer grip to relax itself from my mind, which I hadn't even realized, had developed so strongly. But that's all to say, I can sit here in front of you now, psoriasis free, so blessed and grateful for it. And once the healing journey was well on its way, I got through to Dan and I said, look, there's something beautiful and amazing here, and we've got to bring it and share it with the world. And so that's how InRhythm was born.
Yeah, and I think
Wow. That's
just
incredible. That is like, I never get tired of hearing these stories, but that's truly such a journey and such a testament to what our biology is capable of if we give it the right environment and the right inputs and understand what it really needs. Wow.
Mhm. It was honestly, having been somebody who had some autoimmune conditions and has worked with a lot of people over the last like half decade,
Yeah.
dealing with autoimmune challenges and integrating, like nutrition with sunlight and circadian protocols, like I was incredibly shocked to see the recovery that Jay made in like such a short period of time. And, when we kind of recontacted, which is, it's not too long ago now, I guess it was about only 12 or so months ago now, that we came together and formulated, ideas around what we would begin to pursue within Rhythm. I was at a point where I'd been doing so many things for so long. The CID challenge, I was very fortunate to have a team working alongside me. But it was like the perfect moment for that seed to ripen and for Jay to come into the picture with his like extensive experience in, the corporate and strategic world, and, my passion and experience in like the education and the research world, and the things. I look back at kind of what we've done in the last year, and it's been, it's been incredibly insightful. I think, beginning with education. So we really wanted initially to see, where a fit was in simplifying circadian health protocols and making things super simple for people. Because I think, and Jay would probably agree with this, there's fantastic podcasts out there, this being one of them, right? And I really love, how simple QBC makes this like information in terms of like tangible and practical ways to implement it. But there's a lot of podcasts, there's a lot of people out there who are speaking at such a high level that it's just inaccessible to the everyday public. And we were kind of, beginning to think like, where is the gap? Where is the space? And initially, we began with education, doing things for families, and then moving into a psoriasis dedicated trial.
Yeah. So on the topic of psoriasis, I want to go back to that a little bit. So it's incredible what you guys have built up, but I know a lot of people will share this with their friends or their family who have had that, you know, who are dealing with that issue. And could you like explain a little more what you each think was sort of the underlying reasons why changing your light environment and whatever else you did had such an impact on this condition in particular?
Yeah, look, so I went on a long journey with the psoriasis, right? When the symptoms were at its worst, Meredith, I didn't sleep through the night for more than a year. I would wake up with a blood-soaked pillow every night. As you may know, psoriasis really flares when people are asleep at night. And so the symptoms were really, really terrible. And I went on this journey of trying to understand, because, at first you get told it's an autoimmune disease. So you think about the immune system, and then you're putting the pieces together and you're saying, okay, well, the immune system is actually modulated by the nervous system. So really, are we talking about a neurological problem here, or like really, where is the root cause here? And so I focused on the nervous system, and I made the lifestyle changes that I needed to make to, at least the ones that I thought would rectify this, right? Namely, I left a very stressful job. I left a very stressful relationship. I tried to correct as many sort of life things as I could. And I said, okay, well, this is a stress-related disease. It's a neurological problem. So I'm going to remove the stress, and surely it should resolve itself, right? Now, that's not what happened, because I removed the sources of stress, but the conditions didn't really get very much better. And what I sort of grokked from that is, health and the trajectory of health is kind of like a ship with a big rudder at the back, where you can go through, let's call them triggering events, right? Very stressful jobs or relationships that can cause a big pull on that rudder and then set the ship on a basically a permanently wrong course, unless you try and correct it. So you may be able to get rid of the stressors like the job, but you haven't actually, that might just be, you've sort of taken your hand off the rudder. You haven't actually course corrected the ship back onto the path that you need to get it on. And when I was reflecting on autoimmunity and evolution and just thinking, how deeply unnatural is it to have an autoimmune disease? Like, if you really think about it philosophically, for your immune system to lose the ability to differentiate between self and not self, something deeply unnatural must be happening for that to happen, because this kind of condition simply wouldn't have survived evolution to be as prevalent as it is today. Sure, I can accept a few individuals in the population. I can't accept 20% of Americans, right, having autoimmune and chronic illnesses. And so I started searching for balance, right? Because the only conclusion I could come to is my body is out of balance somewhere, and therefore it has lost this ability of discernment. And I knew I needed balance, but I didn't know how. And then when I learned the circadian principles, the connection to nature, and sort of relearned the evolution story, the light bulb went that this is the balance. This is what the balance is. It's the balance of nature. It's the foundational set of pillars that evolution is based on. And if you can connect your body to that natural rhythm that is the natural state of balance and homeostasis that the body requires as its foundation to actually go and heal. And so that was very much the journey that I went on for the psoriasis. So really, yes, an immune problem, also a neurological problem, in some senses a philosophical and spiritual problem, right? But all comes back to a foundational state of balance, which I was, fortunate enough to be able to find through the circadian protocol.
And I also, I think I would add to that, it's those missing inputs for healing. Like you said, to course correct, it's like reconnecting with those like ancestral principles. I mean, we know that UV and infrared, for example, both have profound impacts, both on like, managing autoimmune. I think it was the Scientific American this year that came out as like, the sunshine cure was the headline of like the big paper that was, I think, of June or July of this year. You've got, Andrew Huberman and people like that sharing this kind of information out there. And when you look deeply into the mechanisms, around like the mitochondria, around healing, regeneration, like melatonin production, like regulation of the immunity through like UVA and UVB, once you begin to apply the circadian protocols throughout the course of the day, then you start to reconnect with that like fundamental power that allows that healing shift to commence on the physiological as well as, as Jay alluded to, like a psychological level. And that's what we've tried to recreate, I guess, in working with some people with psoriasis over the last year is, applying some of these principles that Jay learned to see how effective they've been for other people.
Yeah. And I love, the metaphor that you used, Jay, about the course correcting, because it's like we can take away so many of the stressors that we're under from careers that don't care about our biology to relationships that are perhaps even unconsciously draining us all of the time. But yes, if we don't also correct the inputs that our body is getting, those things alone aren't going to move the needle in the same way. And I think that's a really important point because a lot of times people are like, oh, okay, you're saying light is the only thing that matters. It's like, no. Or people are like, light is the only thing that matters. And then they ignore it. But it really is a full spectrum. But it's just, if we miss that fundamental piece, all of the other things, like those beautiful modalities, the cranial sacral therapy and the Chinese medicine, and like, those are all so powerful. And I think Chinese medicine doesn't talk about light because for thousands of years, it was just a given, right? Like you didn't have to tell people
Exactly. It's the
to
same
get
in
good light because that was the only kind of light that existed.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, look, I'm of Indian descent, right? So Ayurveda has been something I've been very grown up around, and what I realized, even being at an Ayurvedic retreat center, they get you in rhythm, right? They get you in circadian rhythm. They don't necessarily tell you what they're doing because it's so implicit in the teaching. And as you say, when they developed all of this, thousands of years ago, you had no option, right? You could only be in rhythm, so it didn't need to be said. But why I think it's a really pertinent point is because this circadian alignment, like where does it really sit on the health stack? And I think these days sometimes it gets bucketed in the wrong place. It sort of gets put in with other, downstream health interventions, crazes, or fads. But the truth is, circadian rhythms actually behave more like infrastructure. And maybe this is something we'll come on to talk about later, but they actually behave, they act a lot further upstream. They really give, at the most fundamental level, what they do is they give your body a sense of time, right? Which is fundamental to run any and all of the cyclical processes in the body. And so if you don't have that infrastructure in place, you can't be in optimal health. Now, just having that infrastructure in place does not guarantee that you're going to be in optimal health, but having it in place really is, the rising tide that lifts all boats, and that's demonstrated in all these ancient medical practices too.
Yes. Yeah, and I think I totally agree with that because what I see happening is that, the research is coming online and even the mainstream doctors are like, okay, yeah, well, the kids shouldn't be looking at their screens before bed. So they throw it in this bucket. It's like, how many glasses of wine do you have per week? Do you look at your screen before you go to bed? Do you do, and it's just like a lifestyle checklist. And to me, that's better than nothing, but also gives the impression that, it's like, well, I have an extra glass of wine, whatever, which is really not the same thing as having a completely dysregulated circadian rhythm. So, Dan, you're the master of explaining this. Like, for people, talk to somebody, let's say, who is perhaps suffering with psoriasis or anything else, and they're like, yeah, I guess I shouldn't look at screens before bed, but is it really, like, is just circadian rhythm, is it really that big a deal?
Absolutely. When we're talking about like the balance between these specific circadian hormones, right, like melatonin and cortisol, for example. Now, I think it's interesting to understand that, like, I'm going to refer to melatonin in terms of like pineal release of melatonin at nighttime, but we also obviously have release of melatonin or production in mitochondria in response to sunlight and infrared light. But at nighttime, when we suppress melatonin production through this, high energy visible light coming from screens, devices, mobile phones, TVs, laptops, street lights, school lights, hospital lights, supermarket lights, basically every type of light that we have in the modern world, right? And what we're doing is, we're suppressing melatonin, and melatonin is a phenomenal immunoregulatory hormone. It's an antioxidant, it's an anti-aging hormone, and so all of those repair mechanisms, which the body, as Jay, alluded to and so nicely said, just want to complete on a day-to-day basis as part of like the infrastructure and like the programming, like the evolutionary and the kind of aspects of our human biology and how we function in the world. They just become either delayed or dysfunctional or, discredited. And, yeah, sure. After one night, you might not feel too terrible, but the knock-on impact of that after week, month, year, as I experienced in my teenage years, is that like you lose touch with like every aspect of who you are. If you're in a state of chronic sympathetic overdrive because your cortisol levels are dysregulated, the quality of your sleep is decreased, there isn't a single aspect of your like mental or physical or spiritual health that isn't impacted by that, from your mood to your weight, your metabolism, your immune system, like your libido, muscle growth, strength, repair, cognition, your relationships, every single thing. And why I became so passionate about this is because some of the simplest interventions that we have to correct this, they're like the low hanging fruit. Right. A lot of people these days, they think of circadian health interventions as like, oh, it's another thing that I have to do. Okay, like I've got to, change my whole diet and stop eating the foods that I want to eat. And I've got to start exercising and meditating. And I find all these things challenging and difficult. But as we know, correcting the circadian rhythm can be as simple as small, consistent habits or changes to your environment, which you can almost like automate to some extent, right? And so it's, a huge return on investment initially for quite a small amount of effort put in. But as I alluded to, every area of well-being. I mean, when we did this research in schools, we spoke to children and it was like mood, energy levels, focus, alertness, appetite, all of these things can shift within like a week or two. Or, you can go your entire life somewhat suboptimally engaging with your environment in a way in which you may never really like connect with the ultimate potential that you have if you were to address it. And I love this idea and this concept. I can't get it out of my mind, and I don't think I will until the day that I see it happen. It's like, what sort of seismic shift could be created in society and in the world at large if things like the lighting in our homes, the lighting in our schools and offices, or some of these simple interventions were just commonplace, right? And they were well known. Because thinking about it as a gamer, when I used to gamify it, you wear a pair of blue light blocking glasses, or you attenuate your evening light environment. You wake up the next day and you've got 20% more energy, 20% more motivation. You can get on with your colleagues better, or your parents, or your siblings, or whatever. And yeah, I struggle to see how making changes and improvements to your circadian rhythm will not result in a forced magnification of every positive thing in your life.
Beautiful. Yes, there are immediate short-term gains, and then you're also, according to all of the research, probably extending your lifespan and lowering your risk of mortality to a certain extent. And yeah, it's so my background is in executive coaching, right? And there's all of speaking of offices and lighting environments, right? And I watched this kind of trend from that sort of started out like how to support your how to support your team and how to be a good leader, and then we went all the way and ended up in at a place where I was like, oh, we're now asking corporate people to like provide therapeutic levels of psychological safety in a meeting. Like, this is a pretty high bar we've set for these poor people who are just trying to get their work done. But the reason I bring that up is because the flip side of that is there's no thought to the biological levels of safety of the work environment, like none. And obviously, as we've discussed, psychological support is important. You don't want to feel like you're going to be humiliated by your boss at any given moment. Like, yes, it's good that we are getting rid of tendencies towards that. But at the same time, and Jay, maybe you could speak to this, and to your point, Daniel, it's like, when are we going to shift to realize that the environment that we put people in all day long, every day, from when they wake up till like shortly before bed, is having an impact on their health? And Jay is someone who is like in an office, and probably most of your network is still in that life. Tell me your thoughts about that, and how, how things have shifted for you.
Gosh, how
I
amazing.
know I
So,
opened a can of words.
so look, the environment, the health impact and the environment piece is, or the lack of understanding around it, is a very deeply ingrained thing, right? And for me, this goes all the way back to the Human Genome Project, where, they thought they'd understood, or they thought they were going to understand everything about life, that genes held the keys for everything. And lo and behold, human beings have the same number of genes as fruit flies do, right? So in some senses, that project was actually a catastrophic failure, right? Not a failure informationally, but a failure in the sense that it just didn't have the outcome that people thought it did, right? But that narrative that genes are it, you've got your genes, and then that's it. That's the deck of cards that you've been dealt, and that you can only play those. It's a deeply ingrained narrative, right? And so this idea that there is something external to the physiology, right, that looks somewhat unrelated to the physiology, the fact that can have an impact on health is, I think now starting to land in people's minds. But there's a lot of work to do there. Yes, I spent a lot of time in the office. I actually also built and designed the office for Wade in London, and so I was intimately involved in the process for choosing lights and ventilation, this kind of thing. And I am deeply apologetic to reveal that I did not consider any of that at the time. In fact, often when you do fit outs and things like that, lighting is the last thing that goes in, right? It's the last little bit of budget that you've got, and you're like, okay, just put some lights in. And even when people sort of brought up objections around, this light's a bit bright, we kind of dealt with them when we could, but it's light, so if you don't,
it's like, whatever, just get a light bulb so we can see. Who cares?
Light is light, right? Or so I thought, right? And so like, I do have sympathy for old me, and I have sympathy for people in those positions, because the awareness and the understanding just isn't there. And I think things are changing, right? We can see that there's significant growth in, companies that deal in circadian lights. We can see increasingly, particularly in the leisure and wellness space, hotels and facilities coming online that focus on, circadianly aligned environments. And yes, these are businesses that have direct profit motives tied to these things. And that's okay, right? That's where these things are going to start in a predominantly capitalist system. But as soon as, these projects reach maturity, the mainstream awareness continues to grow. And then most crucially, once we really start gathering large data sets around indoor lighting interventions and measuring physiological outcomes, we will be able to demonstrate that there is a biological right and wrong when it comes to how your light should behave, in just the same way that there's, a biological right and wrong for the existence of pathogens in the water that you drink, right? And we came up against that shared environmental stressor as a society, and we built sanitation, right? Upstream. We didn't build more consumer products. We built infrastructure, and we built it upstream, and we took the choice away from a customer, because a customer doesn't have that kind of choice, shouldn't have that kind of choice when there is a biological right or wrong. And so I think the future of circadian indoor lighting is one where it becomes the next, or a new layer in civilization or infrastructure. And that's what we're hoping to build here at InRhythm.
Yeah, no, and that's a really interesting way to think about it, the infrastructure, because that's exactly what it is. Because there's nobody to guide you on that light choosing process. All of the lighting designers, all of the manufacturers, all of the companies, they're like, these are LED lights. Which one do you want? We had someone come through the Institute of Applied Quantum Biology who's a lighting designer. His name's Willie Duggan. He has a really beautiful third generation lighting design firm in Ireland. And he's now working with Scott Zimmerman, and they're putting together presentations for the lighting design industry to get them to come to the level of awareness that you two are at. so that so that there is that shift. So the next person who's designing a new office is going to ask, "Hey, what are my circadian friendly options?" That would sort of be the ideal, right? To have it coming from both ends, like the infrastructure and the public pressure, like meeting.
Absolutely. And what, one thing is pressure coming from the decision maker in the company, right? The other thing is pressure actually coming from the employees of the company, right? Because as this
Yeah.
awareness becomes more into the sort of the kind of common mainstream where, where employees would sit, we would hope to see, and we've sort of seen this in the past with different types of health interventions. For example, at Wave, one of the things that all employees effectively used to campaign for every year was their annual flu jabs, right? Now, we won't get into vax and jabs right now, but that was the intervention that people called for, and we provided it as a company because that's what people wanted, right? And that's actually, when all of the employees are sort of gathered and sort of lobbying together, it becomes an extremely powerful force within companies, and ultimately a coordinated voice that you have to address and support as a business owner. And so I really think a lot of that sort of healthy pressure can come from employees themselves.
Yeah, and I think he also like outside the workplace, I mean, I having done research in schools and having thought about like healing environments, hospitals, care homes, places like that. I mean, care homes is actually one of the most researched areas. I think for over a decade or two now, they've been looking at circadian health, like lighting interventions in care homes to decrease risks of like falls and morbidity like associated with those sorts of things. There are so many people within each of these sectors that are so willing to campaign for, improvements for their children, improvements for their family, improvements for the elderly, all of these sorts of things. And it's really only a matter of time, like as Jay alluded to, like as better and better quality research catches up, I think. And I think a reason that there's been a bit of a lag in the research, or like the sort of research that we really want to see with the best outcomes is because a lot of this like lighting technology is really only just being developed like more recently. There is, I'd like to think now there is like circadian lighting, and then there's like really deeply considered, like salutogenic, like human flourishing, like through the spectral distributions we use, maybe the infrared that we bring back into the environment, like the flicker-free operation and things that weren't available to us, a decade ago. And so like as this technology becomes more widespread, as, fluorescence did, as LEDs did, and things like that, and it becomes more accessible to people, there are more distributors of it, it becomes cheaper, there's more evidence and research behind it. I think I speak to Joe as well, and I say it's our firm opinion that like it cannot help but begin like a snowball cascade towards like a radical shift in how we view this as a society and across the world. And I mean, you only have to look across at some other countries. I mean, in China, for example, like full spectrum visible lighting is mandated in schools in China. Now, again, like I wouldn't say it's necessarily the best lighting. I think, we can do better in terms of like restoring some of the infrared properties and looking at the visible spectrum itself and like which elements we're using. But, they knew that there was this like epidemic of myopia, right? From so much screen use and so much LED technology. And so they've made that shift already. And I'm sure that there are other countries as well outside of the West that are far more clued up about these things than we are. But, in our capitalistic society, when you have these industries that have been built and developed, so strongly around these early stage products from 10, 20 years ago, it's obviously going to take a shift, but that shift is coming.
Super interesting. So they mandated the change in lighting, which is, I guess, a little easier to do in China than here, where everyone gets to have an opinion, which is beautiful. I love it. But yeah, I mean, I'm mostly involved in schools as well, right? And I go to school board meetings and see how decisions are made. Yeah, and it's very much, a combination of research-led expertise, but also the pressure of what the community is demanding and what the community wants. And I think you raised an interesting point, Daniel. Like, so there, like there's a scale that we're working on. There's light that is like actively harmful, and then there's light that is perhaps not ruining your circadian rhythm as much as the actively harmful light. And then there are lights that are actually kind of good for you, because light in nature is always giving us something, whether it's fire or the sun. We're always getting that infrared. We're always getting some benefit from it. So like phase one would be to like at least move from actively harmful light to light that's not dysregulating our circadian biology. But then the next step, and I think this is what you guys are focused on, is to be like, okay, well, what if it was actually a light bulb that was also good for you?
Yeah, absolutely. And, it's not to discredit any of the incredible companies or lighting providers and things like that who are doing the best that they've been doing, the best they can do with information that's been available. But obviously, as the research develops, we begin to understand that it's not just about like melanopic lux, for example. It's not just about having the brightest, full spectrum blue light in the daytime to wake us up. But actually that, when our lights are devoid of infrared, especially those near infrared properties, then we're not getting a lot of those benefits.
Okay, talk to me like I know nothing. I'm like I know nothing.
Let's go for it.
Okay.
So
talk to me like my mom friends when they're like, do you want me to replace all my light bulbs? Do you know what a pain in the ass that is? I'm not doing that. And I'm like, how about just a couple? How about just a lamp? How about just turning them off and putting one in your lamp? What would I say to them?
So I think like the first and like most rudimentary and simple to understand thing is this idea and concept of blue light, right? So there are these specific wavelengths of blue light, we don't need to name them necessarily, that activate this photoreceptor in the eye called melanopsin. And the idea being that out in nature, that light really came on from the time of sunrise, got brighter, got lighter, and more abundant towards midday. And that was like the signal from nature to wake up. The problem now being that, all of these energy efficient, energy saving LEDs are like abundant in this form of what we call like melanopic blue wavelengths of light. Okay. So that's the scientific term behind it. So first of all, we need to like develop lighting systems that can reduce that as the evening rolls around, as it happens out in nature, right? What we're really trying to do is like recreate the equilibrium of nature. If we can follow, as closely as possible what's happening outdoors in the natural world, we're going to come closer and closer to what our biology expects. And I think another key part is understanding that there are two ends of this light spectrum, right? So we have the shorter wavelength, the higher energy photons. We've got like UV light, and we don't necessarily need to go into UV because I don't think it's something that we're going to be seeing in indoor lighting anytime soon. But we've got UVB, UVA light, and then we come into the visible spectrum. So we go the colors of the rainbow through the indigos, the blues, all the way to red. And as you move towards the reds and then get into the infrareds, this is where the wavelengths become a lot longer. They begin to penetrate more deeply into the body, and they're a lot more kind of rejuvenating, restorative, calming, healing. And so in nature, all of the wavelengths of light are always counterbalanced. In sunlight, 50% of sunlight at any time of the day is infrared light. That infrared light is invisible to our eye. And a lot of the reason that it got removed from lighting, because it was initially obviously abundant in firelight to begin with, and then incandescent lights and halogen lights, but because it's a non-visual element or property in light, people who are more interested in energy efficiency are like, why do we need that element, right? We just need to be able to see. And so when we strip that out, what we're actually left with is all this really like high energy, short wavelength light. And yes, it wakes us up. Yes, it stimulates us. Yes, there are, hundreds of scientific papers showing that when you shine a bright, sad lamp, for example, those seasonal affective disorder, really bright, high lux or high kind of luminosity lamps that you get from places like Amazon and stuff, very cheap. People use them in the morning to wake themselves up. Yes, it will stimulate you. Yes, it will result in a production of cortisol. But what we fail to see and understand is that like, there are many other biological effects that could be taking place there, such as like, overstimulation of the stress response, just as one example of that, right? Or like damage to like cells, damage to mitochondria, which can have downstream like other effects on things like immunity and things like cognition, things like hormonal health. So we're really interested in understanding how we can develop lighting that is evolutionarily appropriate. And I love this idea of like indoor lighting being more hormonally neutral. Because let's be honest, because of many factors, not just light, a lot of society, a lot of the population is running around jacked up on stress hormones. And so we can have a circadian friendly light source in the morning that wakes us up and stimulates us. But for some people, especially those who are more prone to stress, that might be a little bit too much of a stimulus. So now it's kind of like, stepping back and going, okay, we understand that we want more blue during the day, we want less blue at night, but like, how can we create light sources which are not causing harm as well as trying to like rebalance this circadian aspect of life?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Jay, do you want to jump in
Yeah, I
on that?
think look, a point that I always think it's important to make when talking about the beneficial impacts of infrared, being added back into indoor lighting, is that it's really important to understand context here, right? Because blue light, even though it sort of gets painted as the boogeyman these days, blue light is not in and of itself bad, right? Blue light is super abundant in natural daylight, right? So just simply look at the color of the sky, right? It's a very abundant form of light. But when you look at a sunlight color spectrum, you see that it's in a very balanced proportion to all of the other wavelengths of light, all of the other colors, as well as infrared, right? And it's this natural mixture that gives proportional context to the blue within the other wavelengths of light. I'll give you an analogy, right? So John Hart always talks about this concept of malillumination, right? And thinking about light like we think about food. So if you take the example of eating an orange, okay, versus drinking a glass of orange juice, okay? If you look at what happens to your blood sugar between those two alternatives, eating an orange, which includes the white fiber and all of the other natural materials that nature created within this beautiful orange, it's not going to do as much to your blood sugar as drinking a glass of orange juice, because in that glass of orange juice, all of the fiber has been stripped out. Everything that is not fluid has been stripped out. And on top of that, a glass of orange juice has 6 to 8 oranges in it versus the one that you'd probably eat normally. And so I really like this analogy because it shows the difference in context, that when you are consuming things, be it food or light, in the proportions that nature intended, they have very, predictable and supportive impacts on your physiology. It's when we strip out the things that nature, provided us in favor of aspects like efficiency or cost, that's when we start to get problems. And so this is why it's so important for us to be putting infrared back into indoor environments.
And, just to add to that, like obviously incandescent bulbs were a great source of infrared, right?
Mm-hmm.
Incandescents and halogens produce, heat. That heat is given off as infrared, but there are also problems associated with that, energy efficient of incandescent bulbs. The fact that they themselves are not dynamic in the way that they shift. So they're not, they're not benign to use at nighttime. An incandescent lamp or a halogen lamp has a full spectrum, but there are still some of these shorter wavelengths, whereas evolutionarily we would have been around a fire, we would have been in darkness at nighttime. So it's important to consider that there could be new and innovative ways that we can improve on like these age-old problems. But most certainly, like replacing infrared in the environment, I think Dr. Jen Gleffrey, I always say his name wrong somehow, Dr. Glenn Jeffries and colleagues, they did a recent study, I'm sure you're aware of it, where they put incandescent lamps inside of like office environments and studied and measured the physiological impacts that they had on people, which was profound. But obviously we're now in this age where if we continue down the route that I think it is the American government planning, incandescents will be, they are already outlawed in most places, and even some of this like energy efficient circadian lighting will actually be outlawed based on like the lumen per watts kind of regulations that they're bringing in. So I think there's a piece here around like bringing new interventions to light, needing to really demonstrate the impacts of them to turn the tide on the current regulatory changes which are set to come into place, because and I could wax poetical all day about, the financial implications of chronic disease and, versus the financial implications of keeping a light bulb on all night and all these sorts of things. But this is what happens when all of these different areas are so siloed, right? And they don't understand, the data and the impacts of regulation in one area and how it can impact another.
Yes. Yeah, no, I mean, the planned and the existing American regulation is basically it's the light equivalent of saying you must eat only candy all day long. That
Mhm.
you may not have any nutritional value coming into your system at all through your food. It's it's that, and I mentioned Willie Duggan earlier. He has a master's in lighting design, and he talked about all of the studies that he did in writing his thesis, and the only kind of metric that they used was like, how well can people see? That was it. Like how far does the light go? How wide is the spill? And how well can people see with it? And there was absolutely zero thought or study into any kind of health implication of the light bulb. And I think Daniel and Jay, you guys, and I had that same experience, right? Where we had our health so profoundly affected by understanding this. And I remember sort of my process. I was like, this can't be as important as these people are saying, or we would know. Like someone would have told us. And then you have your own personal experience and you're like, oh, wow. Then you start looking at all the research. You're like, okay, well, it must be a bit fringe then. And we're just at the beginning. And then you start looking, it's like, no, there is
Mhm.
decades, if not centuries of research, depending how you want to look at it. It's not a research problem. And so then we come to where the three of us are right now, where it's like, okay, what next? This is like a civilization ending situation. And I'm not trying to like be alarmist or dramatic, but I really think it is. If we do not get a handle on this and shift the way that you've both been suggesting to
Mhm.
understand what we're doing
Mhm.
to ourselves and our children,
I,
like
I'd,
we're
I'd
going
love,
down. So
I'd love to,
tell me
yeah,
how, and we'll wrap with this, how you
Mhm.
guys
yeah.
see that.
I think I'll maybe just flip kind of the narrative that we're holding right now, because it's important, right, that we're realistic. And yes, the reality is that our current conditions and the trajectory that we're heading in are only going to make things worse. Unless you're personally taking responsibility and agency for making changes for yourself, your family, and your community. But on the flip side of it, it's like, if we were to make these changes, like what is possible? Because
Yeah.
one of the things that Jay and I speak about regularly is like a dramatic shift in the evolution of consciousness.
Yeah. Well, just
When
to jump in, I think that's what drives our passion, right? Is like we're surrounded now by people who live in that possibility, right? And I'm like, why does every single person my mother-in-law knows have either Parkinson's or Alzheimer's, right? Like
Mhm.
it doesn't have to be like that. And we're now all surrounded by people living into that possibility. And it's like,
Mhm.
we want that possibility for everybody.
Yeah.
Jay.
Absolutely. And look, I think, to your point, Meredith, like this is not a question of more research and science, right? We know there's been decades, as you say, hundreds of years of research on this. It is, there's Nobel Prize winning, research and papers behind it. And that's all the more reason why we see this as infrastructure, right? Because I think historically, when you look at a light bulb or a light fixture, people treat that as a consumer product, right? And particularly now, somewhat separately, this age of AI, and AI is my background. So it's not to knock it in any way as a tool, but it's very much predicated on this more features, more personalization, more choice, more, you, the consumer, get more and more and more. Really what we're looking for here is infrastructure, not product. And infrastructure is very quiet, right? It's continuous. It happens in the background. It's not sexy.
It's
It's not going to be,
boring.
it's not going to be on the front page of Vogue, and it's not got the profile of OpenAI. But here, when you have it as infrastructure working continuously and is to an extent as much as possible actually removed from choice, right? So you don't have to deal with behavior change. And let's be honest, people are quite inundated with health advice and they don't really know what to do when it comes to health. And where in an area like this, when there is a biological right and wrong, perhaps we can, start putting more intelligence back into the environment rather than at the discretion of individual. And I've been calling this concept natural intelligence, right? And because if artificial intelligence is the created, designed intelligence, that focuses on an outward goal. Natural intelligence is that emergent intelligence, right? That comes forth from the normal interplay of life. And natural intelligence is the inherent intelligence of nature and this planet. We just need to get out the way and allow it to take its course. And that's why I truly believe the future of circadian interventions and impact on society comes at the infrastructure layer so that we don't have to think about it.
Yeah, I'd have to agree with everything Jay said, obviously. And I think what's so interesting now and what we're attempting to, and we are successfully doing with the launch of our first product is like developing like the best, like the most salutogenic lighting. Because if we're already seeing huge improvements from like very basic, rudimentary lighting in the circadian sphere that just shifts blue content, then imagine, when we start to think really about like the infrared in the light, when we start to think about like removing flicker, when we start to think about lights that dim, lights that aren't, pumping out huge amounts of EMFs that, are shifting dynamically across the day and are matching the solar spectrum. Imagine some of the data that we're going to get back when we start to look at that on a huge population-based level. It's already undeniable that circadian lighting is important, but once you begin to see like improvements in health through these big population-based, research projects, and hopefully something we'll be doing, alongside you guys at the Quantum Biology Institute because of the research, that you're now propagating and exploring in the communities.
Yeah. Yeah. And thanks for bringing that up. We are looking at practice-based research to, as we're saying, to make this part of the infrastructure. And that was, I'm right on your page, Jay. Like I've always been saying, the Institute is there to like create the infrastructure for a new field of medicine, right? Is to like make it accessible, make it so that it just becomes how things work. It just becomes part of the order of things, as opposed to something that we are tasking each individual person to think about, which I think is a really good point. And you've really come full circle, artificial intelligence to natural intelligence there.
Yeah.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
Beautiful. So InRhythm, you have created a product that sort of exemplifies all of the things that you've both just have described about what we would want in an in-home light. It is a very lovely light bulb. Thank you for sending me one. We have it on at dinner every night and it's nice. And yeah, I find even some of the ones that, even though they're better than the regular ones, they're still kind of really bright. And yours has like a nice soft glow. It feels really good. So we've got the light bulb. And then what's next? Because Daniel, I know you are a person of great vision. Jay, I'm getting the impression
He's a person of
that
great
you
vision,
are
trust
as
me.
well. So blue sky it for me. What's next?
Yeah, look, I think I actually think the formula is quite simple, right? I think what we need to see is the development of a biological baseline, a coherent framework that really in detail outlines how your light environment should behave dynamically through the day and perhaps, adjusted for different use cases, because we don't really have this kind of thing available. Sure, we've got well building standards, right? And well building standards do talk about circadian lighting to their credit, but it's generally fairly high level guidance that they give, largely about melanopic lux at eye level, right? Doesn't really go into much more detail than that, and there's not a lot of data behind the recommendations that they have there. So fantastic step in the right direction, but not the full Monty, let's say. And so we're hoping to build this biological baseline and put together the world's largest data set on, circadian lighting interventions and measuring the impacts on human physiology, right? And then, not just advising and assisting people and companies to adhere to this standard, but actually producing the lighting fixtures and products that allow people to actually get there. So the very simple formula is build a reference point for everyone to coordinate around, and then create the products and services that very efficiently allow people to actually get there. And that for us is the sort of gap that's missing at the moment, that really transcends this out of the realm of consumer product into the realm of infrastructure. And that's the layer, the position in the stack where we see that this can have the biggest societal impact. So that's what we're heads down, fully focused on.
Yeah,
Fantastic. Yeah. It's like when they banned smoking everywhere. You don't have to go up to each individual person smoking on the airplane and ask them to put their cigarette out. It's just no longer there.
Yeah, I agree with everything that Jay shared there, and I think it's so exciting. There are so many researchers in the field already. I think of people such as Dr. Alexander Wunsch, who I know you've interviewed in the past,
Mhm.
Meredith, who have been looking at and breaking down components of light beyond just the melanopic lux and the spectral distribution, thinking about things like the illuminance and the brightness, thinking about infrared, thinking about color rendering and making lights, such as the one that we've sent you, look more human and feel like warmer and more nourishing, and even looking into things that haven't been so widely considered in lighting, such as flicker and like EMF emissions and things like that. And so I think we're in a very amazing place now, because there's so much on the board for where we can go with this, and how detailed and how specific and how considerate we can be in developing it's just not something that's bog standard, but something that is incredibly nuanced and deeply considered when it comes to every aspect of how we interact with and develop lighting in the modern world.
Yes. And listen, I think we can get there. And to everybody listening, you are participating in this. This is a team effort. It's a collective effort of all of us. I think sometimes, as I was saying, when I first stumbled upon this, I'm like, oh, if this was true, somebody would have told me. And it's like, yeah, they did. That random guy on a podcast. That's who told you. It wasn't a health guideline that was published on the government website. And that's where we're at right now. So thank you both for all that you're doing, for your contributions. And Jay, way to jump on this train and drive it forward. Thank you both
Thank
so
you
much
so
for being
much.
here.
Thank you for having us,
Thank
Meredith.
you so much, Meredith. Really enjoyed it. Thank you.
You have made it to the end of another episode of the QBC podcast. Congratulations and well done. Don't forget to visit us at qbcpod.com. That's qbcpod.com. You can find all of the episodes, all the links in the show notes, the tools that I use, links to the Institute, all of the things. And please do join the QBC free community if you haven't. That's where we send most of our updates. All right. Thanks for being here. If you also, please make sure you rate this podcast wherever you listen to it. There's so many millions of places these days, but it really helps. We really appreciate it. Thank you for being here.